Welcome, everybody. So let's get started by introducing the panel. David Aaron began as a Foreign Service officer. He was a task force leader on the Church Committee that was a response to the family jewels. After that, he was the Deputy National Security Advisor from 1977 to 81. He was U.S. Perm Rep at the OECD in Paris, White House Special Envoy for Cryptography, and later Undersecretary of Commerce. Jack Devine is a 32-year veteran of the CIA. He is both acting director and associate director of the Directorate of Operations, also chief of the Latin America Division, head of the CIA's Counter-Narcotics Center, and head of the CIA's Afghan Task Force. He is the founder and chairman of the Arkin Group, which is a boutique strategic intelligence firm. He has written 2 books, Spy Master's Prism and Good Hunting. Jim Taylor also began his career as a Foreign Service officer. He spent 6 years at the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, and 15 years at CIA as Comptroller, Associate Deputy Director for Science and Technology, Inspector General, and Executive Director. And finally, Greg Treverton served on the staffs of the Church Committee and the NSC. At the National Intelligence Council, he was Vice Chairman and then Chairman. He has served as a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, IISS in London. He is currently chair of the Global Technopolitics Forum and senior advisor to the Transnational Threats Project at CSIS. He has written several books, his most recent, Telling Truth to Power, with Bob Hutchings, A History of the National Intelligence Council, which I can highly recommend to you. So welcome all, gentlemen. Thank you for being here this evening. I'm going to give a brief historical introduction so people understand. We all lived through this, but for those who aren't quite sure what we're talking about, I'll do a brief historical introduction and we'll get into the conversation. So this panel, the starting point of this panel is the family jewels, as we call it. It actually begins in April 1973 when the case against Daniel Ellsberg, who had leaked the Pentagon Papers, was dismissed when it was discovered that members of the White House plumbers group, who were out to find leaks, had broken into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist. It was also revealed that they had received some assistance from the CIA. E. Howard Hunt was a member of the group, former CIA officer, and this greatly upset the director of Central Intelligence at the time, Jim Schlesinger. And so he put out a call to current and former members of the CIA, wanting to know if they were aware of any other activities that the agency had undertaken that were illegal or beyond the CIA's legislative charter. Responses poured in is the only way I can describe this. They came into the Inspector General and ended up in a volume of 693 pages. The executive director at the agency, Bill Colby, referred to this as skeletons in the closet. Some wag named them the family jewels, and that was the name that stuck. Colby briefed it on the Hill. He briefed it to the Senate, members of the Senate and the House who were in charge of oversight in those days, a very small group. And they all agreed this all happened in the past. It's not going to happen again. Let's set it aside. However, the family jewels leaked. Seymour Hersh, who was a reporter for the New York Times, got hold of the document, and he wrote an article on December 22nd, 1974. Here is the I don't know if you can see it, the headline from the New York Times with pictures of Colby, Schlesinger, Helms, stating that the CIA had worked against anti-war forces and other dissidents. This obviously created a political firestorm. Only way to describe it. I'm going to stop there with the narrative and just turn quickly to Jack and to Jim and ask, were there any immediate reactions within the CIA and these revelations went on for, I think there were 8 articles in a row, 8 days in a row. Were there any immediate reactions among the workforce at the agency after the Seymour Hersh articles appeared?
I think at the morning staff meeting, the first reaction was OS blank, 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 period. There was a immediate understanding that we were going to be doing a lot of running around, chasing our tails and running down documents and getting ourselves organized, answering questions, etc.
Yeah.
But it wasn't, I don't think anybody appreciated what that really meant until some weeks later.
Okay. Jack?
Well, I was on the other end of the spectrum. I was in Santiago, Chile. And again,
All right.
that followed up. The next investigation was the Chile investigation.
Right.
So we overlapped. But that also became part of this in a smaller way with the
Yes.
assassination of Snyder.
Right.
So, but I can give you from the perspective of someone much further down the pecking order than Jim, and that is, I think the first thing is the CIA is being investigated. I mean, I thought I worked in a secret organization. I learned much more when I was being investigated on the Chile crisis, and then I saw my own cables, and I thought, my God, I joined the agency. I never expect to see it in writing and publication, and I was outraged by it. As the years went by, and I suspect this is true for both committees, I began to appreciate the investigation on both. I think there was a little much too much pizzazz on the family jewels, but when we went back and I looked at the Chile one years later, they did a really good job. I think the facts are there, but I think it was the shock of we were a secret organization. I'm an operator, and now we're looking at this. The second is I had a reaction that was, immediate, that this was not smart. This was not, these were not our best moves. And, as it unfolded, again, it was the hard part here, and some of the others can do this, I'm sure. Getting in the history of the time, the communist world, and everyone was a spy and mole hunting, and I think they read the section of our authorities saying carry out those special activities as directed by the President of the United States to encompass things beyond maybe the original thought of covert action abroad. So I think it was wrong-footed. Jim, you may have had a different experience on this. And when I look back with the experience of having risen further in the service to pretty high ranks, this was really bad policy, and I think I would find it pretty hard to defend, and I think even the people that were asked to commit some of the acts, like the assassination of Lumumba. I mean, Larry Devlin will talk about that later. Knew that this was the wrong path. So I'm just saying, when you write these kind of letters for young people that want to rise in the service, make sure you understand what you're going to get, as Jim will tell you the next day. Everybody will tell you their worst story, right? So you will get more than you ever dreamed about. Doesn't mean you should hide from it, but that was probably not the best move for the agency.
Yeah. So actually, and Chile is interesting because simultaneously, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And Colby was stuck with it. I mean, I think people don't realize.
I'm going to come back to Colby. Let's hold on. Yeah. I'm going to come back to Bill's approach to this. 4 days before the story appeared, the House and Senate voted something called the Hughes-Ryan Amendment, which was in reaction to leaks about CIA operations in Chile. And the Hughes-Ryan Amendment said that funds for intelligence activities other than intelligence gathering, meaning covert action, would now require a signed finding from the president that this was necessary for national security. It would have to have this timing and the scope of the operation, and it had to be reported to 6 or 8 committees of Congress. This was a major change in how Congress looked at oversight. Prior to that, oversight was basically run out of Richard Russell's hip pocket and John Stennis's hip pocket. And so this was a major change, and Chile was the reason for that. So the Ford administration...
I just want to say a word on that, Mark. That was one of the best things that came out of it. In other words, there are schools of people in the intelligence believe that briefing Congress is not a wise idea. I think it's an obligation, but also a very smart move. Right. And I think when it first came out, I think there was some reservation about it, but I want to very early get on the record saying oversight is really important. If you don't have oversight, you shouldn't be doing it.
And as a former staff director of the House Intelligence Committee, I have to agree with you.
Mark, could I launch a point in here?
Go ahead, Jim.
I think there's a really good case to be made that Hughes-Ryan really did all the heavy lifting for the next 6 months. I mean, it was a major event. It's months before Church and Pike got underway, Rockefeller got underway. And frankly corralled about 70% of the issues in one place and caused follow-on actions, which were put on paper a little while later by the committees. That's not to say the committees were irrelevant, but this was a big deal.
Yes, it was. It
And
was a big
hardly
thing.
noticed at the time by management who was looking at the fact of this letter and our needing to organize ourselves to respond to that. It was a big deal.
Hmm. So President Ford tried to, realizing the politics of this, put together a commission under Vice President Rockefeller to try and investigate what had happened and hopefully put a cap on this. This obviously was not going to work. And the Senate created a committee to investigate, chaired by Frank Church. The House, after a false start and some turmoil, eventually created a committee similarly under Otis Pike. In one last historical point, in January 1975, this is a month after the family jewels leak, President Ford was had a meeting with the the editors and the senior leadership of the New York Times to discuss what had been leaked. And he mentioned in passing there are other things that haven't come out, such as assassinations. And then he quickly said, that's off the record. Well, the cat was way out of the bag. And so that added more fuel to this fire. So let me now turn to the church committee. Let me ask David and Greg, how did you get on the staff of the church committee?
Well, I thought you were going to ask what was Church's goals in all of this.
I'm going to ask that too. So go ahead.
Well, I'll start with that. Well, actually, I'll start with this general comment that's very important to understand, that this whole exercise after Hughes-Ryan was not really about the CIA. It was really about the power of the presidency and the effort to try to, it wasn't a normal executive legislative struggle. It was an effort to bring to some kind of control the unfettered power of the president. And it was unfettered at that point. In fact, I remember a Republican member of the committee who was opposed to the committee, but he was on it, who said, well, the reason I'm against it is that I'm part of the King's Party. This was always considered something, the role and prerogative of the sovereign. And we were trying to bring this, and I think Church was to bring it into the democratic framework. And secondly, it was quite clear that the issue was really ended up being not so much the CIA, but the president and the NSC and what their responsibilities were. It turned out that most of these abuses really could be trailed back to the president and the NSC. They initiated them, they knew about them. In some cases, for example, assassinations, Eisenhower was the first to suggest it. And so this was really not a rogue rogue agency. This was, in some respects, a rogue presidency. Now, as for Church, his object, of course, he was running for president, which was odd selection, I thought, to be for this committee, and he wanted publicity. Mm-hmm. Not surprisingly, there had been a conflict in the staff on this whole issue and the members, as between reformers on the one hand and prosecutors on the other, and Church, wanting publicity, sided with the prosecutors, but he knew, and I failed to at the time, since I was more on the reform side, that he needed scandal to get the political horsepower to pry open the CIA, to pry open the FBI, to get reforms seriously considered. And the family jewels, in this context, was a godsend to him. Mm-hmm. It gave him the leverage to do the job he thought he had to do.
Greg, you want to add to
that? Well, for me, it was a wonderful opportunity for which I think David bears some responsibility. He may be responsible for inflicting me on the American public. I was finishing my doctoral dissertation at Harvard, got a call out of the blue to come to Washington to talk to this newly formed committee. I thought I was going for a very preliminary interview, but for whatever, by the end of the day, David, whatever desperation was going on, said, come and join us 2 days a week, 3 days a week, 4 days a week. So I almost didn't finish my dissertation because it was so obviously so important and so exciting. And David characterizes Senator Church's position well. I think on the one hand, he promised Mansfield he wouldn't use this as a springboard to the presidency. On the other hand, he wanted the publicity both for himself and for the inquiry. So he was caught, but it was for me a wonderful opportunity. It spoiled me for working for Congress because it was such a wonderful opportunity. We had the attention of the senators. They would sit still for long briefings that had nothing to do with their political future, just because they were so interesting. They were so sexy. I hadn't seen this before. I remember an NSA guy, code breaker, saying his first line of his briefing was, "I just love Arab-Israeli wars," right? And that was because they were great fodder for code breaking and doing the sort of things that NSA did. So it was a wonderful opportunity. And I think on the whole, well, David's right, but Trump, sorry, Church. That's a terrible Freudian slip. Church, mostly stayed on the straight and narrow. The inquiry was good. What was striking, we'll talk about this later, was when I talk about this period with my students, they can't quite believe it. And even I can't quite believe it, that it was so bipartisan. It's almost unimaginable. It's like, and probably is, not just a different time, but a different America. And the collegiality that was on the committee. David mentioned Barry Goldwater, who was one holdout. But on the whole, the Republican members were participatory and part of the team. We dealt with them all the time. It was collegial in a way that I think is kind of unimaginable on Capitol Hill these days.
I agree. This is how I came to Washington also. I was hired by the Congressional Research Service to support the committees and research. So, and in a way, I mean, we work for both sides. All right, so let me get back to the event. So at this point, Bill Colby was the director of Central Intelligence. Schlesinger had moved over to Defense, and Colby decided that the best course, the only course, was to be as open as possible. Which did that create a certain amount of friction within the agency, Jim, Jack, as Colby said on this course?
Go ahead, Jim.
There's certainly people who wished it were something different, and I suppose I can remember a couple of people who thought, we ought to just stonewall, but that was probably 2 out of 50 who had a voice. It was everybody knew Colby was right, and the view we had at the time really was that when the Congress got into these events and learned in detail what had happened, most of them, everybody would be comfortable with what had happened. I mean, it's not that we were endorsing it or that we wanted to see it again, but they understood in the context of the times why the events took place, and they understood the ambiguities around them. And they were reasonably comfortable we'd come out with a reasonably good recommendation.
Jack?
I guess from my perspective, I think Colby unfairly suffered from it. I think he did exactly the right thing. I think they thought he was naive. I think the boys that thought it was somehow you were going to hold the dike they didn't have the political savvy that you would expect hard-edged operators to have, that somehow you were going to keep that bottled up wasn't going to happen. So sometimes in situations like putting it on the dike, you help save the institution. But he suffered, and again, for a different historical discussion, there's these huge back and forth between him and Dick Helms in writing in the Studies of Intelligence about the view of operations and responsibilities. And I think they're worthy. Spying operations rarely get you troubles. Everybody knows here that isn't your problem. It's covert action, but it's such an important tool. And there historically through the agency, I would say 95% of the employees in the operation want nothing to do with covert action, but they too missed the boat. So this was the wrong covert action, but I think it had a long tail on how one looks at covert action and how you deal with Congress. There was a tone of hostility about it when we moved forward into the 80s with the Iran-Contra affair, which I was in the middle of that, on record against certain aspect of it, was a player, that the relationship with Congress and being straightforward is good for the country, but it's also good for you. You know, it all settles. It all comes out eventually. And so I want to come back and say, you know, I know he's taken a lot of hits on that and people associated with it. I think it's naive to think that any other path was open.
Right. But it was obviously very controversial. There was a big rift between him and Richard Helms, as you say, about why Helms likened this to the Bolsheviks going through the Tsar's secret police files, that they were releasing everything, which was not exactly true. The Rockefeller committee reported basically saying that most of the CIA's activities were within the law. There were a couple of places where they weren't. Obviously, it didn't satisfy a lot of people politically. Greg and David, did the release of the Rockefeller report have any effect within the committee or how the committee was working?
Well, it was a bit of a guide for us to look at the various issues that Rockefeller had looked at. But I think both the Rockefeller and, to be frank, I think the Church Committee really did not look at two very important things in any depth. One was counterintelligence, and the other was defense. Now, there's an extensive report on these things, but it's very superficial. And for example, the CIA had one assassin. I actually saw his picture in the vault of James Angleton. But after the report of the committee was over and published, someone at the Defense Department approached me and said, "You know, you guys just missed the boat. We're the ones that do assassinations, not the CIA. We had 20 attacks, or 20 or more, I think he said, on Fidel Castro. Now, they all failed, but we had at least 20 of them. And I personally know someone who was, in fact, an assassin for the military." So that whole lacuna of what Defense Department was really doing was really not looked at. And I think that's also true in the counterintelligence area. It's not surprising, you know, that the whole thing was started by counterintelligence issues being carried out by the CIA against Americans, and the FBI using COINTELPRO to for Americans. Counterintelligence is a very important area that really has not received the right answer.
Greg, you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with that very much. It was a kind of, the Rockefeller report was a kind of guide for us. And we did obviously started with this focus on the CIA because of the family jewels, right? That had sort of been the starting point. So that gave it a kind of a CIA focus. The thing the committee did was it did get in very much into COINTELPRO. It turned out that, you know, much of the abuse we'd seen was FBI, not CIA.
Right.
So it became that, well, I think David's right that we didn't go into particularly defense counterintelligence very much. The COINTELPRO and all those activities by the FBI became a major focus of the domestic side. We ended up dividing the staff a little bit between foreign and domestic, and it turned out that the much of the work on the domestic side was FBI, COINTELPRO, this curious mixing of counterintelligence, but also surveillance, but also, you'd have to say, covert action against people like Martin Luther King. That became a major focal point of the report, and I think really appropriately so. So we started out, I think, focused on the CIA, because that had been the focal point and CIA sexy, but it ended up being, at least on the domestic side, a very big look into what the FBI had been doing.
Right. In fact, it's probably useful if I sort of tick off some of the major areas that were investigated, which it begins with the CIA and this their surveillance of dissidents during the anti-war demonstrations, but it also then spread to the assassination issue, the MK Ultra program, the illicit drug testing program, the FBI's surveillance of people, NSA's cable, you're tracking cables. They looked into the Houston plan, which we will skip. It touched on the IRS. And so it wasn't just, at the end of the day, for both committees, it wasn't just the CIA. I mean, this spread out, which was also part of it that was so fascinating, that it was basically almost every part of I think every part of the intelligence community got dragged in. State INR got dragged in on the Pike committee. And so it begins with the CIA report, but as you say, Greg and David, it spreads out so that every agency at some point is part of the investigation, which leads to a different vision of what's happening in intelligence. Actually, there's an interesting on Colby. Is interesting anecdote in his memoirs. He talked about testifying in front of the Rockefeller Commission, and at the end of his testimony, Rockefeller came up to him and said, "Look, Bill, do you really have to share all this stuff with us? And keep some of it secret." And Colby said, "I got the message and I didn't like it." So there was also a major rift between Colby and Kissinger. Kissinger was absolutely irate about the way Colby was approaching this. I mean, completely irate.
I still stand by what I said, even if it's Henry Kissinger. He and I have not always been on the same wavelength, but there's one thing, Mark, I don't mean to interject here.
No,
but
please, go ahead.
The assassination piece is, to me, the centerpiece. Why? If I want to be critical, I'll be critical of the Church Commission. It was the holding up of the gun and the dramatics of the and the public never really understood what David just said a second ago. All those fantastic cases never came to fruition, right? I knew a fair number of people that were asked, a couple anyway, that were asked to do it, Larry Devlin and so on. They never came to pass. But the drama of it's really fascinating how much people, whether it's the movies today, still somehow think we're in it. After this, it was as if we were injected. You weren't even allowed to mention the word assassination for the next, 30 years. So it was probably the most defining moment. Later somewhere, I would like to revisit how we look at assassination today compared to that moment. There has been a shift without people recognizing it. It was an abomination during the Church Commission. And now we look at it somewhat differently. And we don't look at political assassinations.
Right.
I have a vignette, but I'm going to save it about drones and the government and the use of them. But because I don't want to go off tangent, but I just want to come back. Assassination is one of the big issues here, and there was a lot to do about nothing. I guess I'd come back to both David and Greg. It was really about getting control over the process, but I think that was lost on the American people, and it was about assassinations.
Right, and Church made his famous rogue elephant remark. The CIA
a rogue elephant was the other one.
Which he later withdrew.
Every speech I give, whatever any group, I say, let me explain covert action. There's never been a covert action ever, because I went back personally and researched this when I had access to it. There was never a covert action that wasn't approved by the president.
Right.
But all of them, and this is, God bless the committee on this, all of them thereafter, everything you don't like as the American people about covert action and the CIA has been authorized in writing by the President of the United States. And I think that's the biggest misunderstanding that, if I'm given an opportunity, and thanks to the Church Commission, I use the rogue elephant.
Right.
Well,
this rogue elephant story caused an enormous amount of anguish at the end when the Church Committee report was being written. I don't know which version we're talking about, but there were agency people sitting in the discussion saying, you can't say that, remember this, and trying to help clarify the facts. And we tried very hard to get the committee to take the view that the rogue elephant issue had been put to bed. It was not put to bed, and everybody went away very disappointed and shaking his head. 3 or 4 weeks later, it did get taken out of the eventual report. And the only real service that Pike, in my humble opinion, performed during this whole thing was standing up for exactly the view that Jack was talking about. He said, "You've got it all wrong. It's the president approved all of this stuff. There's no rogue elephant. If there's anything, there's a rogue president, or two or three."
Go ahead, David.
No, I was just going to second Jim's comment because, and it's important to recognize this because that's the lesson for now. I mean, the president can still sign. He signs a lot of executive orders, but he can still sign a lot of findings that might not sit very well with us.
Let me turn to the Pike Committee quickly. We couldn't find any staff in the Pike Committee. They took a very different course in this. They disagreed on the rogue elephant. Was there much either cooperation or competition between the Senate committee and the House committee? Greg?
Yeah, no, I think we mostly, not much cooperation, not much sense of competition. We, I think, worried that the Pike Committee was going to be irresponsible. As you stated, they got some things right, but we worried that it wasn't quite as measured, it wasn't quite as careful, it didn't seem to be quite as bipartisan as.
It wasn't bipartisan.
Yeah, so we more worried about it. I don't recall cooperating with it really at all. Basically, we were doing our own thing. Just
Greg, I can add a vignette to all that because in the very early days, some staffer from Pike came out and to see me. I was a controller at the time, and he said, "I want all the budgets." And I said, "Well, do you have a security room for them? Do you have we put all the people who are going to handle them through security clearance?" I said, "No, I want them this afternoon. I want to take them out and put them in my car." And I took them into our registry and I said, "There's probably 1,000 feet of budgets here. And there's another couple thousand feet in the archives of the United States. And until you get a security cleared room and security clearances for the people who are going to handle it, it's no go." Well, later on, there were stories that when they finally did get the documents, they were stored under people's desks and in drawers in the office, in the house, one of the house office buildings. Appalling stories. I don't know how true they were. At least some of them were, I'm pretty sure. But
yeah,
ultimately, he was a hero for his role with
good question.
The other one.
What is the return you get for your intelligence dollar? Which is not an really answerable question. I know I struggled this when I was running the staff on the House side, but it is a good question. It is a difficult question. This is also a very difficult time for CIA. There were 4 directors in 4 years. There were all these public hearings. Colby is on TV night after night. Jack, Jim, do you think that there was an effect on CIA capabilities?
Well,
I don't. Jack will know better than I do, but I don't think there was.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this is one of those things that, let's say, if we're talking about a big spy case, it breaks. Everyone said, "Well, no one's going to want to work for us," right? But that's not true. That's not true. People still want to work with us. So again, the reaction to the all this activity sometimes leads to more interest in the business.
Mm-hmm.
He's not going to like it, and God rest his soul. David Wise wrote a book, The Invisible Government, right?
Mm-hmm.
Criticized it. I read it and wrote an application to the CIA. So all I'm saying is, people didn't like it, but they went about their job. It was like, okay, somehow, that's not us. We have our job, and it it was no longer relevant by that time. I mean,
Any
really,
publicity is good publicity.
yeah.
I'm not sure
Yeah,
that's
probably
true. Let me turn to the recommendations. David, I know you just went back and reread them the other day. What strikes you as the most significant recommendations and findings of the church committee?
Well, you also asked what we didn't do, and what we didn't do was prohibit covert action.
Right.
That was really on the table at
Mhm.
one, and I think we're glad that's the case. They also did make clear that the CIA was the only people who could do it. Now, that's not trivial because some administrations since then have thought about using the military to
Right.
that covert action. I think obviously the big recommendation was no assassinations. This has become a little more problematic when we now have the era of what we call targeted killings. Uh,
Mhm.
and what the difference is between assassination and target killings, well, maybe it's because they're overt, but on the other hand, any killing is overt. So I think this is a really interesting problem. And the earlier comment about maybe we need to revisit and discuss that more deserves attention. Uh, Obviously, I think the notification of Congress for covert action and other sensitive intelligence was a very big recommendation, and I think to the large extent has been fulfilled. Uh, the National Intelligence Budget approved by Congress was recommended by the Church Committee, and that has come to pass. The creation of a real DCI, that is what's now called the NDI, was started then, and it took a long time, but it's finally happened. Um, the and the creation of political intelligence organizations. I mean, various intelligence operations around that, and Greg might want to speak to that because he participated in some of it. We prohibited no intelligence operations against U.S. citizens without the AG's okay. We had a ban on supporting the recruiting U.S. press journalists, production of publications and so forth in the United States. That was a very important finding, but I wonder what it means now in the era of the internet. Is the CIA on the internet? Does it do anything with the internet? Should they do anything with the internet? How do you avoid blowback if you use it? I really don't know. And they banned covert military operations without congressional approval. And finally, legal charters for the CIA,
Mhm.
other intelligence organizations. And then there were a bunch of other variety of organizational recommendations that were important. So I think that a lot of those recommendations have come to fruition. Some less strong than they were argued for by the church committee, but I think on whole, it's a remarkable record of things that ultimately were implemented.
But I just make a comment on two
Yeah,
of
go ahead,
them.
Jack.
Just just two of them, because I think they're very relevant. One is the agency should be the only one doing covert action. Right?
Mhm.
And I think the next major flap in this area was the Iran-Contra affair. And that's the classic example of the White House running an operation.
Mhm.
Yep.
And there is a great temptation to run things, out of the White House. And that almost brought down President Reagan's administration because of the way it was handled. The second thing, which goes to actually 2 points that David made, one earlier about assassinations, and the other was the oversight of the military in covert action. It's my perception that why we have been rigorously exposed to oversight, that the military's covert is involved in actions that somehow is preparing the battlefield. It has another word for it. So I don't know whether, I mean, I don't think that particular measure was given much credit. And I think that's gone on for a long time. I'm not even sure where it is today. So I think there's activities that take place in the military arena that sure as hell look like covert action to me. So I think that's one that all those I thought were appropriate, by the way. And one on the media, I would say, yes, of course, we shouldn't be using American media. But this is where I did notice the reaction that was a negative one. Up until that time, there was a close relationship abroad between media and ourselves. Journalists would come in, talk to people, they were friends, and it became toxic between both. Mm-hmm. So we went too far. We never touched an American journalist. They never talked to us again. I'm not sure that was healthy nor the intent.
Yeah.
And I think David's point also today is a whole issue of how do you monitor this anyway? But I think there was a big loss there by having not being able for journalists that have common interests in talking to each other and keeping the secrets. So I thought that was something I saw even as a young man.
There was one recommendation that we made that we should not use any religious figure in the United States, and that didn't have a very long half-life either because of September 10th, when we discovered that there were many Muslim clerics or people who call themselves clerics who were involved in these kinds of activities. So not all of our recommendations could last forever.
Right. Greg, what's your take on the recommendations?
Well, I think David's run through them very well. For me, in some way, what we were doing was making intelligence part of the American government, for better or worse. We were saying, okay, now these, for me, did a lot of work on documents. I've worked mostly on Chile, some on Laos, on Chile, as Jack knows, and we'd spend hours in skiffs at the CIA going over documents, and it was painstaking, but it was also interesting. And what we were doing is, seems to me, establishing the principle that these were the government's documents, not just the executive branches and not just the CIA. Congress had some co-responsibility. It goes back to David's comment at the beginning about kind of the balance of power. And what we were saying is, Congress has a role here now. It doesn't look so great in our current gridlock now. But in those days,
Greg, you noted that I tipped my hat to you on that, right? You noticed that earlier in this discussion. I hope that lets you sleep better at night.
Well, thank you. It was fascinating to be sort of the world expert on covert action in Chile. It turned out to be I think probably a good thing. I wrote a book about it later since we had the.
So did I.
Could I add a point?
Let me move forward here in time.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mark, could I add just one point to this?
Yes, Jim, please go ahead.
We're all talking to ourselves, and we all lived through this, and we all understand what happened. I think if you're watching this and you're 35 years old, you have no idea how little oversight there was before any of this took place.
Yeah.
I can remember Dick Helms telling the staff meeting that he'd seen Senator Russell yesterday, and they talked for 20 minutes, and Russell asked him if we could take a reduction in the budget of $1 million. And Helms said, I guess we could, if it's really necessary. And that was it. That was the hearing.
Yes,
that was,
Richard Russell
on the House side did the same thing.
No, Russell did this personally. In fact, there's a story that when John McCone became director after Dulles was fired, he sent a letter up to the Senate about some issue, and Russell called him up and said, "Now, John, you can send letters up here without my seeing them, but if you want me to take care of your oversight, I see your letters before they go to the Senate. Do you understand me, John?" "Yes, Senator, I understand you very well." So there was a totally different time and place. Let me just move the narrative forward if I can.
I was just going to say the Senate was not entirely ignorant of what was happening.
No. Russell, at least Russell and Saltonstall were aware, but after that.
And Mansfield, when he created the committee, he said, "Now you're going to get into assassinations. You're going to get into relations with the mafia. You're going to get into things that the FBI has done with Martin Luther King." So he was very well briefed on things before.
And Mansfield had tried to create an oversight committee in 1955, and Lyndon Johnson, working with Dwight Eisenhower, had put the kibosh on that one. So Ford loses his bid for a second term, not for re-election, since he was never elected in the first place. Jimmy Carter becomes president. David, Greg, you guys moved to the White House. Carter writes his own executive order, superseding the one that Ford had written. Senator Mondale, who was on the committee and been your patron, David, is now the vice president. How did the Carter administration see its mandate vis-a-vis all that had gone on the previous 2 years?
Well, principally, we decided that we would try to turn the recommendations of the church committee into some, and some of the others, investigations into an executive order. They weren't called executive orders. What are these things? They were called intelligence executive orders or something. Anyway, we created a new charter for the CIA of do's and don'ts, and
Right.
that and one thing and the other. And we thought that was our responsibility, and we did it.
Greg, you want to add anything to that?
I think mostly we were in the business of trying to implement what had happened, what the church committee had done. And, we had day jobs, so we couldn't pay all that much, as much attention to intelligence as we had before. But the idea was that, this was the track we were on, and could we implement the things that needed, particularly charters? That was really important.
Right.
And David's mentioned that. So that was having some legal charter. This relationship between Congress and executive branch is sort of stroke and poke, right? That if Congress knows enough about you to help you, it also knows enough about you to try and tell you how to run its business, right? And so that's always the tension. Was always tension now, right. And now the situation is so different. But that was the tension we were trying to.
I might just add one thing about oversight. We thought we got oversight by the Congress got to be so robust that we thought that the CIA was working for the Congress and not for us.
Well, that was obviously a major outcome. Is the Senate created an oversight committee, and then 17 months later the House did, and we're going to deal with those issues in a separate session. Let me ask a wrap-up question, because I want to get to questions and from the people who tuned in. I want to ask each of you the same question. What do you think the most important takeaways from this experience are for the people running the government, the Congress, the White House, the intelligence community today? Jim, you want to start?
Oh boy, that's kind of a biggie.
We'll take a piece of it.
One of the things that I noticed about this that nobody's commented on all, when you read about crime in America, other than violent crime, there's almost always financial gain involved. There was a story just the other day about the rot in the whole world of Alzheimer's research, which was in the New York Times. You may have read it.
Mm-hmm.
He lists dozens of people who are taking money on the side, representing both sides of the issue for folks trying to market medicines and so on. It's a really unseemly picture, if just a fourth of it is correct. There was no such picture when we got into the CIA and the FBI and stuff. There was nobody working for private gain. There was no one trying to feather his own nest in some major way. I've always been impressed by the nature of the crimes that different groups in society can participate in and be a part of. And the agency's crime, I suppose, was following orders from the top. I don't know if you had to say anything. And I wouldn't change that for a second. I think, it's got to be that way. I'm trying desperately to get back to your question, because I'm not sure what my take out of all this was. It did put the rules in place that we pretty much have lived with for the last 50 years, and they were good rules, and they're working pretty well.
Very good, Greg.
Yeah, this sounds sort of Pollyannish in these days, I suppose. But for me, this goes back to Hughes-Ryan. We started with that. The principle behind that was, at least the philosophy behind it, was that if the president had to advise, had to sign on the dotted line, he might get interesting advice from politicians that weren't him, that didn't depend on him. And maybe a wise president would take that as advice and say, well, maybe I should change this or do something different. That does sound almost impossible in these current circumstances, but the idea that having a separate set of politicians not beholden to the president have to know about and maybe talk about, or at least give advice about, that was for me a powerful point, and one that does seem, I fear, sort of irrelevant in current circumstances. But it was for me the spirit of the thing that involved a different set of politicians, not dependent on the president in these major decisions, seemed to be a good thing to do.
Great thing, David.
Well, I would think the most important takeaway is that only the Congress can provide real oversight. Not that it always does, but it really can be the only thing. The internal reforms that have been taking place, as well as the ones that in legislation, they assume that the individuals like the Attorney General, the FBI Director, the Director of National Intelligence, they will all carry out their responsibilities responsibly, with integrity and respect for their offices. But it's not all that clear that this is going to happen now. I don't think we can assume that now. Congress is as effective as it can be. It really is the last resort of accountability.
Thank you, Jack.
I think we all learned the lesson of the importance of oversight and how useful it is. I think the battle was won, right? Now, that isn't to say that the Iran-Contra affair, was a break in it. And we have to be alert for those breaks and insist that they be handled this way. But there's one thing that I think is missing. I mean, the whole event was about covert action. And yet no one's defined the principles of it. Now, read my 2 books, you'll find them. But there's good covert action and there's bad covert action. And Greg, in the case of Chile, you saw both running side by side, in my opinion. Track 1 and track 2. You saw behavior of not advising the ambassador. In other words, we often, yes, President, and we're going to go march forward the covert action, but you need to sit down and ask yourself basic questions that are rooted really in the philosophy behind a just war. I mean, you really have to have measure. And I've added to the just war bipartisan support, make sure you get fighters on the ground, so forth. I don't think enough thought is given, even by the pros today. We're doing with the president, it's legal, ends justify the means, don't justify the means. I think there's room here for thought on when and how you use it. I happen to be a strong advocate of it, but on a very selective basis, it's critically important. I think we didn't get that done.
No, thanks, Jack. All right, I'm going to turn over to Dana and to Dana Dice and George Jameson, who have been checking the Q&As for questions. Dana, what do we got? If it's to a specific person, that's fine. Otherwise, I'll sort of figure out where we should go with it.
Yeah, there are more general questions, not to specific panelists, Mark. So I'll feed that into you.
Okay.
Tee up. I should say, I think myself, I'm a CII advisor. I retired a little over a year ago as the Deputy General Counsel of CIA for operational law. I'm more commonly known as DO Legal. And I find this a fascinating discussion because you're talking about the history upon which my entire career, my legal landscape was based. So it's fascinating. And I love the covert action talk as well. We had one member in the audience, and there may be more, that just wanted a repeat of the CII website. So I'll do that real quick. It's intelissues.org. Email is cii@intelissues.org. And if you can't remember that, just Dr. Google Council on Intelligence Issues, and it'll pop right up. As far as questions, we had many questions, and I'm afraid we're not going to be able to get to them all in the allotted time. But a few related questions as to the identity of the leaker. who actually leaked that information to Seymour Hersh. One person in particular wanted to know, did he get the info for his expose from his brother? And if so, were there repercussions from the brother?
I don't even know. Jack, Jim, do you have any? I have no.
I don't know
think
that
the
story.
leaker's ever been identified.
No, I don't know that either. No.
Well, it's also
don't
clear
think so.
that the story had a lot of pieces. I mean, the story about MK Ultra is different from the story about assassinations. Is different the story about the drug experiments testing. So I'm going to think there's 38 leakers in there.
Well, there's an interesting sidelight here. When Hersh brought the story, first Hersh came to see Colby to tell him what he had, and Colby took the meeting was he felt he owed Hersh a favor. Was Hersh had sat on the story of the Glomar Explorer.
The Glomar Explorer.
Hersh had found out about this and agreed not to publish it, which actually reporters will do from time to time, as we all know. And so Colby felt that he owed him one. And he listened to Hersh, and Hersh took the conversation as confirmation. But I don't think the leaker has ever been identified, as far as I know.
Not as far as I know. No, either. No.
All right, so we didn't answer that one.
You got any more like that?
That's not the only leaker we didn't find.
Hitting it out of the park so far. We had some color commentary from a member of the audience. I don't know if they want to be identified by name, but they wanted to appreciate in your discussion about CIA not being a rogue element. They say, I was the Pike Committee aide who set us off on the path that the CIA was not a rogue element. And you are absolutely spot on. So that discussion was much appreciated by that.
I'd like to congratulate him and thank him. They didn't. They were a lone and very powerful voice, and very much worth listening to.
Let me just add an anecdote on that. Later on, once the rogue elephant thing was going away, we were having a hearing. This was a church committee. We were having a hearing, and Colby and colleagues were coming. We had a picture of elephants, trunk to tail in a long line. And we captioned it.
Greg and Jim, I don't want to disappoint you, but it only went away in your mind. The rest of the world still believes we were a rogue elephant, and today Hollywood lives on it. Okay,
no question.
But that was you couldn't win that battle. Okay, they were outweighed on that one. That was just not. No one tone deaf on this issue.
Yeah.
Well, that was the whole point of not just Hughes-Ryan, but other things, to try and make clear that was clear, that this was the president in charge, and it wasn't the CIA on its own. And I think we
just slow down a bit. There is, as much as I believe that the responsibility for all this lies with the president and the NSC and the National Security Advisor, there were a few things that were a little out of control. MK Ultra, for example, the testing of drugs on unwitting Americans was not something that was authorized by the president.
Right.
And also, James Angleton's collection of information on Americans was not something, as far as I can tell, was authorized by anybody.
The HT Lingo program, the general counsel at the time said, hey, this is illegal as hell. The
only thing, gentlemen, the advantage of the committee was it was in writing. I'll submit that maybe you don't know who was involved.
Yeah, well, these things were, these were bureaucratic momentums and things that they thought they were trying to do what the president wanted. Believe me.
Right. I think that's spot on.
But not necessarily authorized by him.
That's why you have to codify them.
Yes.
Okay. Another good question that came in. What effect did the December 1975 assassination of Richard Welsh, the CIA's chief of station in Athens, have on the work of the Church and Pike committees?
I worked for Dick Welsh.
Go ahead, Jack.
I said I was his assistant, and before I went to Chile, I was a greenhorn. What a gentleman! What a class act! I mean, spoke Greek. Somebody you would love to work with, and I think it was a tremendous blow to the agency. A tremendous blow, and anger, a genuine anger, and so I don't think there's many things, and that led to the protection of the identity of CIA officials. He paid a huge price for it, but it's. I know I don't know anybody that didn't weep in that day when Dick Welch went down.
But also, the Ford administration used it. I mean, Dick Welch he was not a senior person. He was chief of station. He was given a state funeral, or the equivalent of a state funeral in Arlington. The president was there. The director of CIA was there. The director of the FBI was there. And they used this. And I think, at least from my perception, it began to move public opinion the other way. David, Greg, what do you think?
I agree with you. I mean, I think it was exploited politically. And we tried saying we had nothing to do with this.
Right.
The idea was this was a leak. Somehow his name got out there, and so forth and so on. And in the end, it ended up costing Frank Church his seat in the Senate, because his opponent in the following election used it against him extremely effectively.
Yeah.
Don't you think it kind of bookended the whole year?
Yes, it did. I think so. Jim, I think it did. Absolutely, yes.
I agree.
It was
an important moment. I'm glad they brought that up. That was good. Thank you, Dana.
I mean, it wouldn't have had it been a year earlier, but it
Exactly.
happened when we were winding down.
So here's a question that I found interesting. How did the KGB, and I'll just add, or other foreign adversaries, take advantage of the turmoil that existed during the Family Jewels era?
Jack?
Yeah, I mean,
I'm trying to think that whether they did.
Yeah.
In other words, actually, if you look at it in reverse, you would say there's a democratic process in action, right? And I'm not sure, how you could. I mean, today you could. I mean, today with social media, you could get on in blogs and all this stuff. But I'm not sure that I noticed where the process. Were they able to get new recruitments? Were they able to penetrate? Were they getting more sympathy? Were we less vigorous against going to Russians? I think they understood what was going on, and I can't think of anything that I could point to. I would say a couple of things that in Chile they decided they weren't going to try to win an election by the ballot. I mean, there's things I can point to that from Greg's report that they might not have liked. So I don't think there's a breakthrough there. I don't think it changed the game.
Yeah, I don't either.
There's a little bit of a feeling in a lot of the questions when I hear and when I've gotten in these conversations in other places that the CIA must have just come unglued, that all of a sudden everybody stopped doing his job and worked on the investigations. And that really is the organization has absorbed a lot of blows over the years. This was not by any means the biggest one. It may be the longest lasting, but we were extremely flexible and tough-minded, and there were thousands of people doing their jobs who just barely knew about this other than because they read it in the newspaper. The organization went on very strong.
So on that point, relations between the Church Committee and the CIA were, from my perspective, very collegial. We joke and we met all the time.
David got Bill Miller and me together for lunch a couple times. I mean, and that happened with other people. It was joke. Extremely collegial.
Yeah, when we'd call Bolton, Seymour Bolton was one of our main contacts.
All right, yeah.
And we'd call him, and in those days the CIA answered the phone with phone numbers, right? So they'd say 5551, and we'd say something like, "Vladimir, we have the information for you." So it was a very collegial. It had tough points for sure, but on the whole, it was a very collegial undertaking. And I think that goes back to Bill Colby's approach to it. It really was a joint investigation in many respects.
Yes.
I think the Soviet Union did, however, take advantage of the revelations in their propaganda. I mean, they certainly, directed all their various places where things happened, Latin America in particular, but other parts of the world, Africa, and I think they also tried to use it as a way of undermining liaison between our people and our allied intelligence services saying, well, you can't, you can't trust these people. They're going to leak everything. Everything's going to come out. So they tried their best to exploit it as much as they could. I don't think.
I think they tried, but two things. I think the world actually believes, in fact, America, no one's going to like this. They still believe Hollywood and think it's okay. In other words, despite what we've said, they think, well, what, you should be assassinating me. In other words, so I think if the Russians pushing that out there, of course, it was very hypocritical. But I'm not sure people said, "Oh my God, I'm shocked that CIA is doing." It's like, of course they were doing. What the hell do you think they were doing? And we were horrified. So I think that's probably a bit different. As far as liaison concerned, I will say, and Jim, you want to back me up on this, I don't know. I always thought, oh my God, am I going to be able to? Is the service chief going to, say, look, I don't want to see you every Friday. I'm going to see you every 6 weeks. No, they somehow realize they accept a certain level of I was going to say foolishness. That's the wrong word, but they have a higher tolerance for things going wrong. And the next day, I'm trying to think of how I can describe this one incident. I think I'll clean it up a bit. The head of a service, I came to see him one day and he said, Jack, see this letter? I don't mind you spying on me, but don't send it to me. Someone put his letter back into the folder that went back to him that we intercepted. I'm just thinking, but he was like, oh, of course that's what you guys do. Let's go have, some spaghetti and meatballs. But so, I think they tried, but there is something about the power of our relationship that they sort of say, yeah, we have to deal with you anyway. We'll make the best of it. And somehow life goes on. And we do great ops together. I've never felt that they held anything back from me. And after any flap, we were more embarrassed. We were more uncomfortable. They said, well, it's just the Americans again. Jim, am I anywhere close?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I used to say, and I've long since given it up, but I used to say, if somebody says the Department of Education has got a major criminal investigation on, is there any school district in America that's going to say we're not going to talk to them anymore? And that was the argument being made about, if all this press and all these events in the newspapers, the services aren't going to trust us. And I saw zero influence of that. I agree with you.
We've had some big spies, and we know them, Ames, I knew, and so on. The services went on with this. There was no change. Yeah. It's like part of the game. Right. And they know themselves that they were penetrated. So, yes, there's less damage than you think, but I'm discouraging damage. Let's do everything against it. We don't get any damage. There are other reasons why you don't do it.
Dana?
Well, that question came from Randy Ford, the former head of INR, if I recall correctly. So he may have some views on that himself.
Well, we haven't always agreed, Randy and I.
Neither have I, but okay, Randy is a pro.
You can do some post-webinar discussions. Okay, and looking at the time, this may be the final question, but one of the audience members wants to know, did the commission or perhaps the other committees or the committees also investigate agency participation in domestic spying against civil rights organizations in the U.S.?
David, Greg?
Well, yes,
you guys know more about this than we do.
They did this extensively, but neither Greg nor I were directly involved in those investigations. But I was working for Walter Mondale, and he worked very hard on trying to uncover what was going on in the FBI, a meeting with the surviving members of Hoover's group and so forth to understand what was the full extent of COINTELPRO, and they really looked into it very well. And I think they discovered a lot of things that were revealed in the report.
Well, I think that's exactly right. In some ways, it seems to me the COINTELPRO investigation was, in some ways, the most powerful thing the committee did, partly because there'd been family jewels in the Rockefeller report before that, dealing with foreign intelligence and the CIA. So that, I think, in some ways was the most important product of the Church Committee.
And if you read the Church Committee final report, it's foreign and domestic activities.
Right, absolutely.
And I think that the real revelation, that the blockbuster one, was their effort to get Martin Luther King to commit suicide.
Right, right.
And that was about the most reprehensible of activities.
Dana, do you have any more questions left? We're almost out of time, but
I wish we'd finish on a higher note than that.
You guys had a higher note. You said this was necessary. This is the American experience. It improved oversight. We had some very positive comments earlier on, Jack.
The ending was like,
let's end on one. Yeah.
We're not ending on COINTELPRO. Do we have any more questions, Dana?
Yeah, well, there's a question about how did the revelations about domestic spying change intel policy, which I think you've talked about that.
Right, well, the FBI changed what they did. Hoover was dead, which made life somewhat easier. I mean, the FBI, they also came under greater oversight. I mean, but for J. Edgar Hoover was an incredibly careful individual. He never did anything without having top cover from the president. He was very, very careful about that. For all that he did, and Franklin, having written this history that John mentioned earlier, Franklin Roosevelt, more than any other president, was the person who enabled J. Edgar Hoover. Really let him do the things he wanted to do, or do what he did with top cover. So the FBI, NSA had to change their surveillance of what was then cable traffic. Nobody remembers cables anymore. I mean, it affected a whole bunch of other agencies.
Absolutely.
And now the charter legislation never got passed. The successor committee produced this huge bill, S2525. I remember it well. It never passed. But the Intelligence Oversight Act was passed in 1980, which made intelligence oversight provisions part of the National Security Act. So there were a bunch of positive changes. If the goal is to have an intelligence service under law, this is all a very positive moment, I think. Now, Jack Devine has to leave us at this hour, but we can go on if there are some more questions. Jack, I know you have to leave. Thank you very much for taking part.
Very much. It was a great opportunity to be with a terrific group of people that know what they're talking about.
Good to see you again.
Okay.
We can hang on for a couple more minutes if we have more questions, Dana.
Okay, one just in that says, David made a great point that people do what they think the president would like to see happen without formal approval. Wasn't that at the heart of the Iran-Contra situation with Director Casey and the NSC's Ollie North wanting to find a way to help the Contras around congressional prohibition?
Well, remember, President Reagan said, keep the Contras alive, body and soul, which was a very Reagan-esque thing to say. And yes, North interpreted this as he wanted to. Casey, with Casey, the issue is, when did his brain tumor begin to affect his performance? And there's no way to track that back in time.
I think one of the most important things about Iran-Contra was that the normal situation was reversed. Instead of the CIA providing deniability to the White House was denying, and I'm sorry, instead of the other way around. What happened was that the CIA became cover for the White House.
Yes.
They are allowed to do things that the CIA normally wouldn't do, or couldn't do without consequences. So, I think that was a very serious breach of the system, and I don't think it's been fixed.
Well, the NSC is not structured to be an operational arm.
No. But the point about accountability and making sure the president's in the line, I think, was well described in a comment by Dick Helms. He said, in the old days, he said, if I get this directive that says I should do everything possible to neutralize Castro and his regime, I'm not going to go back to the White House and say, does this mean I can kill him?
Right.
That wouldn't have happened. But that was the problem we were actually trying to fix, to make sure that didn't. There wasn't that looseness in the chain of command and accountability, so that Helms or someone worse than it, I've been a great friend of Dick's, but so that other people wouldn't do things that they thought were authorized, but
Right.
didn't ask. Didn't
I
have a-
remember that Dick Helmscourt, he said, I thought our job was to keep those things out of the Oval Office. We have
Right.
one more question. Before we go to that last question, let me just tell the audience, we're going to have 2 follow-on sessions. The dates will be posted later. One follow-on session will be more on operations and how Iran-Contra affected operations going forward. And then we'll have another session on the issue of oversight, which, as I mentioned, the Senate Intelligence Committee that we know today is the direct result of this experience, the House Intelligence Committee as well, and we're going to have a session on changes and important issues in congressional oversight. So Dana, let's have the last question and then we'll wrap things up.
Okay, so the last question is, after 9/11, there was yet another effort by Congress to reform intelligence, insofar as the existing structures and practices were seen as contributing to failures that led to 9/11. Do any of the speakers feel that the post-Watergate reforms went too far or contributed to later failures?
Certainly, one of the things that was at play in 9/11 was, we, the Church Committee and beyond, said there needs to be a big wall between law enforcement and intelligence, including in the FBI. And that did, we have to say, play some role in the failure at 9/11. Now that wall has been unbuilt. We may regret it later for other reasons. It was that sharp distinction between law enforcement and intelligence that we tried to establish in the Church Committee and beyond. And that did play some role. And you can see in the meetings in New York, the FBI and CIA people really didn't know what they could tell to each other.
Mm-hmm.
They were worried, the FBI people were worried about blowing cases. The CIA people said, are these people really cleared to hear this stuff? So I think we fixed one problem, which was COINTELPRO and the mixing of sort of intelligence and law enforcement. But that did play some role, I think, in 9/11. And now we've, for better or worse, built down, demolished that wall between intelligence and law enforcement, including the Bureau.
And now we have an individual. When I worked for Director Tenet, when Jack was working, when Jack and Jim were working at CIA, you only did foreign intelligence. The DNI now can do foreign, domestic, and homeland, and that is a major conceptual change. You still have foreign intelligence agencies like NSA, like CIA, and domestic intelligence agencies, but you have one individual who now can roam across that entire landscape, which was not the case. And that's probably a good idea, in my view. I mean, I was not a big fan of creating the DNI. I testified against it at the time, but I think that concept that somebody has to be able to do all of these together is good. I'm going to wrap things up now. First of all, let me thank the panel. Greg, David, Jack has gone around. Jim, thank you. That was a wonderful discussion. Thank you, guys. And I appreciate the time and effort you put in. I know it took us a long time to get to this evening, and I appreciate that. I also want to thank Holland and Knight for sponsoring this, and the Spy Museum as well. And a particular call out to Rachel Benazutis and to Bailey Wynn, who were working behind the scenes to make sure this all happened.